Welcome to Watchtower History.
We're neutral. There's a difference in here. We didn't object, but we didn't want to participate in any form of warfare.
And then I was witnessing all the time, I was discussing with the other prisoners. And then I got books in there, but I was amazed that they were not censored. There were some books that wrote about Christian neutrality. And this was written one from a Pater Lippert von Munich, what wrote, if we Catholics want to be really true Christians, we must refuse every military involvement.
The Jehovah's Witnesses never shared the close relationships over historical time with secular governments that the regular churches do, especially in Europe. The regular churches are almost at times a branch of the government. The Russian Orthodox Church was a branch of the government. Stalin, Peter the Great, it didn't really matter. The German church always received subsidies, both Catholics and Protestants, from the German governments. They were always involved in political agreements with the governments, and therefore they were tied in with the political establishment and could hardly turn against them, and did not when the crisis came. So we have this spectacle in history of bishops and priests on one side supporting one nation, and on the same religion supporting the other nation in a war. Something that is hard to reconcile with the universal message of Christ. The Jehovah's Witnesses, the real contrast comes down to this. The Jehovah's Witnesses retained their faith in the power, grace, and love of the Lord. And most were willing to suffer or even die for that faith and for that faith alone. The mainstream Catholic and Protestant hierarchies in Germany lost that faith somehow in their concern for the institution and the political arrangements of their church. They did not guide their people. They did not take the role of moral leadership, although many of their flock did take good moral positions.
So again, the witnesses were very strong in their voting neutrality. And there are photos actually of what was stated in the documents before, of the witnesses being paraded through the city saying, I didn't vote, I didn't support the Nazi state. And they were ridiculed and beaten, publicly humiliated. And this article here, Nazi fascist attacks on witnesses, says about this neutrality: sticking to Jesus' rule of being separate from the world, JWs in Nazi Germany refused to vote in the elections. The Nazis submitted them to public humiliation. Max Schubert from Saxony was put on procession in a horse-drawn wagon with a sign held by stormtroopers saying, I'm a scoundrel and a traitor to the fatherland because I did not vote. He was paraded through the streets to the public chanting of, where does he belong? The mob's answer, in a concentration camp. Very soon, thousands of witnesses were consigned to those infamous camps. Here's that neutrality issue again, and we've had a discussion on the neutrality issue. Be sure to check that out. But here again is that article series that was done in the 50s on the modern history of Jehovah's Witnesses, and it goes into a little bit more detail than the Divine Purpose had actually done just a little while later. On November 1st, 1939, the Watchtower published an article called Neutrality. From what we can see, if you look at the English versions of some of these magazines and then you look at the German versions, it would take a couple months to translate an article. So in English, this neutrality article was November 1st, 1939. But it was translated into German in the January 1940 issue. So there's a couple things here. Germany invaded Poland in September 1939. So Rutherford's response to that invasion, I think, is to write this neutrality article. It would have taken a couple months for them to get it into print. If you look at Vindication Volume 2, in Vindication Volume 2, there's a giant shift that Rutherford makes in Watchtower theology surrounding the Jews. And remember, this is a period where there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and Watchtower is picking up that anti-Semitism. So this is the book, that is the book where Rutherford changes everything. That book was more than just a Watchtower article. It would have taken quite a while to translate all 3 volumes of that book into German for that to come out. That was July 15th, 1932 when that came out. Hitler came to power January 30th, 1933. That's only a period of a few months. So the Germans really didn't have time to get used to the idea that the Watchtower theology had shifted to something new. And so what that is, why that happened, that's a future discussion. It's another discussion for another time.
Again, and remember this, and the short version of what he just said is Hitler believed that the Jehovah's Witnesses were pro-Zion based on previous publications.
Yeah, they went after them because they loved the Jews, basically.
Yes, before Hitler really came to power and started his activity, Vindication 2 came out, which changed their viewpoint of the Jews and their feelings toward them. So what Jeff is basically saying is the Nazis didn't have time for the translation of the book and to realize that they took a different stance. And we'll get into that when we get probably to the Declaration of Facts, as we'll probably discuss that in a little more detail.
And so, they were trying to pin on the witnesses the idea that they were communist agents. They couldn't prove that. But they could prove that they were pro-Zionist, at least before Vindication.
They loved, they were for the Jews.
And so
which Hitler did not like.
No. One of the reasons they're being persecuted is also because of their Zionist stance, because of their Zionist beliefs. Of course, that changed during the Rutherford period, but it's another one of those reasons that they're being persecuted.
Despite the evil and hardship at Ravensbrück, Frau Kusero kept her faith. Her son Wilhelm had given his life for the faith, and younger brother Wolfgang, when called for military service, showed true Kusero defiance.
I was brought up as one of Jehovah's Witnesses according to God's word contained in the Holy Scriptures. The greatest and most holy law he gave mankind is, you shall love your God above all else and your neighbor as yourself. Other commandments read, you must not kill. Did our Creator have all this written down for the trees?
One of the Kusero children was among the Jehovah's Witnesses who were executed. Wilhelm had been inducted, but as a Christian he had refused to participate in military service.
Also wir bekamen dann den Brief eines Tages von meinem Bruder, der schrieb ganz kurz, gestern habe ich Verhandlung gehabt, ich bin zum Tode verurteilt, bitte besucht mich doch noch.
One day my brother wrote, yesterday I had my hearing, I was sentenced to death. Please come and see me. Since my father was in prison, my mother got everything moving, found out about the train and told me, Lenchen, you'll come with me. A lawyer and an official were there. Wilhelm was happy to see us. Mother said, if only I could take the sentence upon myself, if only I could die in your place. But my brother said, no, if only it were over.
A few hours before his execution, Wilhelm was allowed to write one last letter to his family.
All of you know how much you mean to me, how harmonious things always were at home. Nevertheless, above all, we must love God, as Jesus Christ commanded. Here in court, they made a great effort to save my life, even at the last moment, But if I had changed my mind, everything would have been lost and in vain, and I would be far from God's favor, and my inner anguish would be greater than it is now that I know that I have acted in full harmony with God's law. Now I ask you to keep praying to the Almighty Creator, who has made all things and for whom nothing is impossible, for all the faithful, for yourselves, and for me.
Wilhelm couldn't accept the authorities' offer to save his life, for it would have meant offering his services to the German military.
Also during the war, more than 250 Jehovah's Witnesses were executed because they had refused military service in Germany and Austria. This was not a problem for witnesses in occupied Europe, because witnesses in occupied Europe, particularly France or Poland, were not expected to serve in the German army, so the question is one that came up with particular harshness for Germans and Austrians.
Factories had placed their facilities around the concentration camps in order to exploit the prisoners' manpower. A group of Jehovah's Witnesses worked not far from these former Siemens buildings.
Eines Tages kam ein Offizier der Wehrmacht und die Schwettern sollten diese Sattelteile zählen. Und darauf erklärten zwei von unserer Kolonne.
One day a Wehrmacht officer demanded that we count saddle parts. Upon that, two members of our crew explained that this would be military work and thus against their consciences.
Und jetzt war natürlich für uns alle die Entscheidung, wie verhalten wir uns.
They were slapped in the face by the guard and insulted and reported. They were separated from us as we marched into the camp and were taken to the bunkers. They got 25 lashes. Afterwards, they went to the punishment block, where they only got a warm meal every third day.
Sind dann wohl später noch, erst kamen sie in den Bunker, haben dann 25 Schläge bekommen und anschließend kamen sie in den Strafblock mit Hunger, mit Essenentzug, bloß jeden dritten Tag was Warmes zu essen.
Of course, our whole crew faced the question, what are we going to do? What am I going to do? What am I supposed to do? I didn't consider it military work because my employer wasn't the military authority. My employer was the company and the camp, and moreover, a war isn't fought with saddle parts. Thus my conscience allowed me to continue the work. The other sisters likewise acted according to their individual consciences.
Und ebenso haben auch die anderen Schwestern gehandelt, jeder nach seinem eigenen Gewissen. Denn die Bibel sagt, dass jeder in
The Bible says that everyone must be fully convinced in his own conscience. If I fail to consider something carefully, and then I have to suffer on account of my own foolishness, it's hard for me to endure the ordeal. If, however, someone is convinced of having done the right thing, then he's got peace of mind. And this peace helps him gain the strength to endure repression.
Conscientious objectors were systematically convicted by the judicial authorities and executed. The concentration camp prisoners, though, were beyond the reach of the judicial authorities. They were subject to the despotic rule of the SS.
Ich war in der Zimmermannskolonne am Barackenbau beteiligt.
One day, the military authority made an inquiry. After I'd replied that because of my convictions I couldn't serve in the military, I was told, then you will be hanged. Forward march to the penalty unit.
Nicht am Wehrdienst teilnehmen kann, wurde mir gesagt, da wirst du aufgehangen.
To begin with, I was made to stand at the camp gate. There I stood from 6 until about 10 p.m. Suddenly an SS man came with a rope and said, "Look, Bible student, this is what you'll hang on pretty soon." And he hung the rope on a hook.
Mit einem Strick und sagt, guck an, Bibelforscher, da hängst du gleich dran.
After a while, another SS man came and opened the camp gate. "Bible student, run away or you'll be hanged." I said, I know. Shut the gate. Aren't you afraid? I said, no, I'm not afraid. Shut the gate. He came back again when it was dark and opened the gate again. Bible student, run away. I said, shut the gate. Not this way. Well, then you'll be hanged. After that, I stood at the gate until midnight. All of a sudden, the camp elder came and told me, get back to your block. When I got to the block, the brothers touched me and asked me, is it really you? Yes, it's still me. Of course, they were awfully glad to see me alive.
My brother Johann Abwäger was called up for military training in Austria in 1937. He refused to go for conscience reasons and was sentenced to 1 year in Klagenfurt prison in Carinthia.
And then he stretched forward his hand to me and he said, give in, I want to save your life. I said to him, thank you, I can understand from your standpoint, but I rather give my life than that I would take the life of others. I rather die than to give up. Then tears running down his face, and then he just went back and he sunk in his chair behind that speaker's podium, If you do this out in the battlefield, he said, you are on the spot executed. That was the law, in such a case.
Even Simone Leifster's friend, Marcel, he was a conscientious objector and was drafted. She said, if my departure was postponed, Marcel's wasn't. He received his draft notice and had come to say his goodbyes before leaving that same evening. He was the first one of us 3 to face the lion, the hungry, terrifying beast. Marcel sat in our little pink room for the last time. He was bright, calm, and serene. His trust in Jehovah was total. He aimed to live up to Jehovah's law of love, you shall not murder. It says here, we prayed intensely together. Our vision was distorted by our brimming tears as we looked at each other, but we all blinked hard and held them back. Muffled sobbing sounds came out of my throat, but Marcel said, don't worry, one day I'll install your new cow shower. His warm hug expressed strong emotion, his upright, elegant stature and his determined steps as he walked down the street became a living part of my memory. At the corner of the street, he turned around, and we saw his handsome face for what we knew would be the last time, that is, until it pleases God to reunite us all. Marcel was taken less than 2 years after her father's arrest. Was I on the list? Would I be next? I hoped so. Mom's arrest was also due. So I found it interesting that they were looking for persecution.
Well, where did they get that idea from?
There's a scripture there that says, if you were a follower of Christ, you would get persecution. And so they were taking it very, very literally. This was an evidence that their faith was the correct one to them.
Picking a fight is not a fulfillment of a prophecy, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. I happened to notice Marcel's comment that he said he would never kill or support any war effort, not even as a civilian in a weapons factory. Jeff and I had a discussion. We had a discussion on Rutherford inspecting in Australia the Bethel area and the Bethel brothers of Australia at that time, who were actually engaged in that same type of activity.
This says that Rutherford was satisfied about the commercial activities and commended Brother McGilvray on his initiative.
Wait,
what commercial
Jeff,
activities were they doing?
Wait, Jeff, commercial activities? I thought this was a non-profit corporation and organization. So what commercial activities were they involved in?
There's a Great Depression around the world, right? And a lot of the witnesses in Australia were having difficulty finding work. So somebody found a way to start a business and employ a lot of the Jehovah's Witnesses who are out of work. And in that way, they could continue the preaching work. Because without money, you can't really get around either, right? And so Brother Rutherford goes to Australia to check out the initiative, right? And to see how it's going. And he says, good job, keep it up.
So, for the record, he was there. He physically was there, physically saw it, and then approved and praised. That is correct.
And published it, right.
And published it.
And there's video of him there and photos. And there's Brother McGilvray, the one who started that initiative, in the upper right corner with Rutherford there. He was branch supervisor of the Watchtower Society. So I'm going to read here. One of the reasons for Brother Rutherford's visit was to examine complaints about certain commercial activities that the Australian branch had developed to give brothers employment. He was satisfied that these things were not harming the preaching of the good news and commended Brother McGilvray on his initiative. However, later on, these enterprises were to bring trouble and difficulty. And I learned about this through the Mike and Kim's channel. And I thank them for pointing out that information. And they got that from a gentleman in Australia who had some documentation by the name of Matthew Christopher. He's the one who originally found this. So thank you all. That this was very interesting find.
And it enables us to tie it in with what we're talking about and into our discussion. So thank you.
Right. So what were they building? What were they doing? Rutherford knew because he went there. So the July 15th, 2012 Watchtower. This is pretty recent, right? It says, soon after the start of World War II, the printing and distribution of the Bible literature of Jehovah's Witnesses was banned in Australia. So as a young child, I learned to explain the basis for my faith using the Bible. I made a practice of taking my Bible to school to show why I would not salute the flag or support the war efforts of the nations. So the Watchtower of today is trying to make it out that we did not support the war in Australia during World War II. Now remember, Rutherford just went there. We just saw that.
And let me go back to an outright quote. And he was satisfied that these things were not harming the preaching of the good news. So what we're going to go about and tell you, what they were doing was actually allowing the preaching to take place, which we're not going to give you your opinion on that, but we're just pointing that out for you to make your opinion. Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry to interrupt you with that.
And remember, they would have sent donations, right, to Watchtower Society. So if they're making money, they're sending it also to Watchtower, right? So what were they doing? Did they have a neutral stance, as this 2012 Watchtower suggests? Did they or did they not support the war effort? Well, in the April 1st, 1947 Watchtower, in an article entitled Unhampering Gladness in Australia, it says, so the Commonwealth government in Australia placed a ban on the Lord's work shortly after the war broke out. And being fearful that some of the truth might go on these stations, the government closed them. The brethren generally who were put out of work on these radio stations had now gone into the pioneer work, or even reverted to being in good company publishers while taking up their own occupations in life. Perhaps little harm would have been done. That's interesting. But instead, other commercial enterprises were opened up under the direction of those at the branch office, and the brethren were asked to operate sawmills, bakeries, numerous farms and piggeries, printing plants, machine shops, army canteens, etc., all of which brought the brethren right into worldly pursuits. And in many of these occupations, they were truly supporting the war effort.
Now, commendation for printing this, even though it was decades ago. Yeah. 1947, you said? I can't see it. Either 1947. But they left out the fact that while they're saying some of the brothers were doing this, they left out the part that Rutherford was there, right, and approved of it. That's a big piece of the picture to leave out.
And Rutherford saying, "Good job.
Good job. Yeah. Keep it coming. Keep the money coming."
A little bit further down, this article says, there were others who had been called in for work who became so busy with printing things and things pertaining to this world, working in machine shops, producing instruments of war, or serving soldiers in canteens, that they soon lost their appreciation for the truth and were lost in the sea, eventually drifting right back into the world, no longer having a desire for the good things of the Lord and his full-time ministerial service. And so that's why the 1983 yearbook is dealing with this, and they honestly mentioned that as well, because it was a dark era of Watchtower history for them, right? At least in this one, I can say, good job trying to be honest with it.
The Bethel brothers of Australia at that time, who were actually engaged in that same type of activity, and then came back. He approved it, said everything was fine, came back. Now, granted, after it was disorganized, even Knorr took it a step further and completely disseminated it. But they were there were Jehovah's Witnesses working on war effort type things, and
that's why Knorr
money. Yeah, they were making money in Australia.
Yeah. That's literally why Knorr shut it down after the war, is because he realized what a contradiction that was. That story can be found in the 1983 yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses. The full story is there. It's just a fascinating story. And we covered that in our neutrality discussion. So there's a story by Edward Warder in the March 1st, 1987 Watchtower. And he says, at the outbreak of World War II, I was called up for military service. I consistently refused, and the military court of the Reich in Berlin imposed the death sentence on April 10th, 1940. My wife was fetched from home to persuade me to join the military. She, too, remained unmoved and earned the respect of an elderly officer who remarked, I must admit, your attitude is quite right. War is inhuman. My wife was left without a breadwinner to support her and our 4 children, and her aging mother. Did Ruth ever complain? In the few letters she was allowed to write, she encouraged me to remain loyal and not to become weak because of the loved ones I was leaving behind. And in October 1940, his sentence was rescinded, but he was still kept in various concentration camps. In the book, Death Always Came on Mondays, persecuted for refusing to serve in the Nazi army, it tells the story of Horst Schmidt and how he and his parents became Jehovah's Witnesses and how they went underground. They lived illegally, they were hunted by the Gestapo, and they hid in the apartment of a Jewish woman upstairs from his parents' apartment. So here, instead of having witnesses hiding Jews, we have Jews hiding Bible students. I thought that was quite a reversal of the story. In this story, it says, if we constantly dismiss their stand as just an act of political neutrality, we deny the fact that they were Christians who, at a time when the conscience of the majority was asleep, refused, as they still refuse, to take up arms against fellow humans and other nations, and that their stand under Nazism actually left its mark on the history of the German General Republic. And that's from Dr. Hans Hesse. There's another quote here from the book. It says, it was at the time of Lent, the 13th of June, 1943, when the doorbell rang with a loud and violent noise. And there was a thunderous hammering on the door as if somebody wanted to break it down. I don't recall who opened it to them, but the intruders entered like a storm, tore us from each other, and roared, "We got you, finally! You've made fools of us long enough!" All kinds of threats and curses poured like hail over my head. They handcuffed me and gave way to all their rage with kicking and beating. That's how we ended up in the Gestapo prison of Danzig. So you'll see some of the documentation and the letters that this individual wrote from the camps that have survived to this day. Here's a letter from another concentration camp where one of the Jehovah's Witnesses says, "I don't touch guns, no weapons, I don't touch ammunition." The SS replied, "So that you can go to heaven, you'll be going there without delay." Then they filled his pockets with grenades, put them in his shirt, both diffused and live grenades, but he removed them all and threw them away. They then beat him until he was motionless. We thought he was dead, but he was tough. They never tried to force ammunition into his hands again. They had respect for him after that. Another prisoner was employed in a private enterprise, was arrested because of his refusal to cooperate and work for the army. As a consequence, after the interrogation, he was taken to Auschwitz. And there's a lot of those Auschwitz documents that are available to the public. It was actually on March 16th, 1935. That's when Adolf Hitler reintroduced compulsory military service. So as a result, the JWs were exposed to further serious difficulties. Following the end of World War I, a refusal of military service didn't have any consequences. But on May 21st, 1935, this military penal code was decreed that tried to force people into that. So the witnesses really didn't have a choice at that point. So again, as we've looked at this timeline of events, month by month, week by week, day by day, all these little things, all these little laws and rules that the Nazis are putting in place keeps confining the witnesses more and more until they have literally no liberties left. And they end up in the camps. Garby also says, because those witnesses who refuse military service or try to evade it, there were also some IBS members who complied with the draft, so some who did agree, even though it caused them pains of conscience. In April 1940, a 31-year-old Bible student from Hamburg and father of 4 children reported for duty. He had previously refused to join the military service. His reports indicate the great stress he experienced as a result of his decision to join, which he had made out of consideration for his family. As far as possible, he tried to avoid abandoning his principles, to remain humane and decent even during the war. Because he refused to comply with orders in his unit on the Eastern Front, he was taken into custody. He says, because of my refusal, I was supposed to be shot to death. I don't know why this didn't happen. During the entire period of the war, I did not kill a single person. And so that's similar to how the witnesses, or the Bible students, as they were called at the time, were dealing with the First World War. You know, they didn't mind at that time. They didn't have that neutrality stance. They didn't mind at the time if somebody was in the military. They just thought it was best that they were in a non-combatant position or that they should not kill. And after Russell died and Rutherford took over, Rutherford took a harder stance on that. And we'll get into some of the reasons why Rutherford chose the path that he did and that neutrality stance. There's a lot that's tied into Rutherford's early history and the political movements that he was involved in, we think that led to his decisions. And we'll get into some of that in a future discussion. Hitler also addressed the subject of Bible students. There's a statement he makes about them that's recorded, and in Garby's book he mentions it. Hitler said, "These elements, however, who refuse to go to war because of their religious convictions should be reminded of the fact that they obviously have no problem to take the food for which others have fought. However, for the sake of justice, this is not acceptable. Therefore, let them starve to death. The fact that they, the so-called Bible students, 130 in number, were not left to die, but instead were shot to death, should be considered a special act of mercy on his part. Incidentally, these 130 executions had quite a sobering effect. On hearing of these executions, thousands of like-minded ones lost courage and no longer tried to evade military service by quoting some Bible texts. If someone wants to be successful in warfare, and particularly if he wants to lead a people through difficult periods of time, he should make sure of one fact. In this time period, anybody who excludes himself from the people's community, actively or passively, will be eliminated by the people's community. And it was 8 weeks later, on August 1st, 1942, that Hitler talked about them again. Hitler stated that these Bible students had to be exterminated. And once again, he referred to the social concepts of Darwin. Any society that surrenders to the anti-social tendencies actually gives up its struggle. Even in the animal world, antisocial elements are eliminated. And so we'll get into some of the documentation behind some of these statements of Hitler in a future discussion. And we'll also look at more of the accusations that were made against the Watchtower and the Jehovah's Witnesses at the time. And so there was an independent paper that some of the German Jehovah's Witnesses were publishing, and it was a little more militant than even the Watchtower's version of it. They were stronger. And so they had questions or answers to frequently asked questions, which dealt with subjects that had resulted in controversies and differences in opinion. And so Garby here says, such controversies involved questions of performing military service without arms and taking the military oath. They also involved the issue of how to deal with people who had been expelled from the religious denomination or who had withdrawn from the association to wait and see. People who had adopted a radical position were seriously criticized, those among them who were indecisive and fearful. At least those who considered military service without arms as a possible alternative took into account the Christian commandment not to kill. And so there's a split in the movement here as to how to handle these situations. And they're starting to have disagreements with each other as to what to do. And some are taking a much more militant position than some of the others. Some might have seen those who accepted military service as a compromise, and some might have saw the other as just plain out and out martyrdom for the cause, which is some might have saw as suicide.
And different people have different personalities, which affects things. And I'll give this, and maybe this is a good example for it. I remember going to a wedding, and at the wedding, there was a guy there who just loved taking the microphone and singing. That was his thing. He had a good voice, and he used to love to sing into a microphone. And when it was time to eat, he then had a stance. He started going, okay, now everybody here, let's clear this table here. Got to say, by doing it the way he did it, it went smoothly and equally. But there's some people who resented it, that he was telling them where to go. And me, on my part, I'm like, you know what? If he feels like he's in charge, just let him. Would I have been back then more a person? Okay, hi, Hitler. He wants to hear it. Move on. Let's go. It's not a big deal. Whereas some people, I'm not going to say hi, Hitler. So a lot of things are opinion and perception and are related to our own personal personalities, aren't related to our own personalities. So what some people might feel is good for them and other people think is an abomination. And I think you have a lot of that in there. So look where it got some, look where it got others.
And some of those stories about these people who had these pains of conscience are in the Nazi record. So Garby talks about somebody who was drafted to a probation battalion and says We had an older roommate of the name of Fuchs who attracted our attention. He was difficult to judge because he was very shy and reserved. Only gradually did he open up, and we learned that he was going through a serious crisis of conscience because of his religious beliefs. He was a Bible student and, as a result, had been subjected to legal punishment. Now, he wanted to refuse being trained in the use of weapons. He also did not want to take the military oath. We immediately realized this was his death penalty. We three had several discussions with him. He had 3 or 4 children. Repeatedly, we tried to explain to him that this was only a matter of going to prison. Now it was a matter of life and death. Continuously, we told him to think of his family. We also told him that during a military operation, he could shoot past the target. After a considerable period of time, he began to understand. Finally, he participated in the training, but he was still struggling. He was, however, able to keep himself under control. Then a certain technical sergeant was looking for an orderly, and we persuaded him to apply for this position. It worked out. As a result, his situation improved a little, especially in consideration of the fact that during the military training, he was viewed by his superiors as useless and as a coward. After a while, there was a second conflict. The time had arrived for taking the oath. He didn't want to participate. His highest leader was God, and I think they're referring to the Romans 13 passage again, and he would only be obedient to him. He would not take an oath in acknowledgement of the Führer. Finally, Emil Schaffer and I got the idea of suggesting to him that he should act the way the Sinti did. This would be the gypsies, the Romanian gypsies, when they were requested to take an oath. While they raised the right hand, the oath, with 3 of their fingers spread, they put the left hand with 3 of their fingers spread on the back. According to an old superstitious belief, in this way the oath went right through the body and would therefore be ineffective.
And that's what I was saying earlier about that guy at the wedding. How some people just took it. They did not, and I'm watching it. They resent. Some would literally go do just the opposite of what he said, just because of where it came from, and others were sure, okay, yeah. And here we go right there. They handled it in their way. The oath meant nothing. Once again, saluting the flag or standing like at a stadium with your hand over your heart. Okay, for a national anthem. Is it worth making a big point that you're not doing it? Or just, stand up, go through with it? You're acknowledging who is in charge, who your country is, who's in charge. That doesn't mean you choose God over the or choose the country over God. It just chooses you're respecting the higher authorities, who the Bible actually talks about as the higher authorities. So here we have an example right there of some better ways to handle situations.
Like in the Simone Leipster case that we saw, one of the little girls at her school suggested, well, why don't you, do, or one of the teachers, I can't remember which, suggested to her, why don't you do what I do? I don't believe in it either, but I just heil with the left hand. I don't heil with the right.
In those days, the Catholic priest used to come to school to teach Catholic religion in school, during school hours. This is still going on in my home country. Oh yes. And so when that man came in school, before the war, there was a cross in the classroom. Not a Catholic school, plain state school had a cross. When Hitler came, they took the cross down and put Hitler on the place and the cross underneath. Well, when the priest came before Hitler, his greeting would be, "Blessed is the one that cometh in the name of the Lord." As soon as Hitler came along, The priest went like this: Heil Hitler, blessed is the one that cometh in the name of the Lord. And the whole class would say, Heil Hitler, Amen. So this I have seen over and over and over again.
From the very early days of the annexation of the area that she lives in, the children, her friends, her great friends, she'd been a popular kid at school, are asked to stand to salute the Nazi flag, to sing German songs, sing the anthem, and particularly on every greeting, so simply to the teacher when they come in the morning, to raise their right arm and say Heil Hitler. She thinks long and hard about this. She, for a few times, she just kind of tries to hide herself and, you know, not be seen, and then decides she can't do this, she won't do this.
Wie du grüßt du mich, Heil Hitler, das Bild der Führersorte. Du wirst entlassen und musst gehen. Heil Hitler! Heil! Sieg! Heil!
Sieg! Heil! Sieg! Heil! The whole class. I was standing there, you know, my fingers were like that. And I was determined. I said, I want those papers. Those papers. During the 5 minutes, they sounded like hours. My head got like this. My feet got small. I got cold and shivering. But the only thing I had in my mind, I want those papers because I want to hail my Lord. In the middle of the week, my teacher said, you come home with your mother. We went to his place. The name of the teacher was Zipf. He was a Baptist. He talked with mother a long time, and he said to me, look, I fully agree with you. I don't hail Hitler either. You look at me, you know, I do it with the left hand, not with the right. I don't give my support with the right hand. I do it with the left hand, and I pray to God and said, you know, my heart belongs to you. This is just to keep my freedom. Do it like I do. I said, I can't. For me, it's a lie. I cannot lie. The Bible says you shouldn't lie. I cannot agree with it. Left or right hand, I do not want to hail.
And for Simone, that was still too far.
Yep.
So it depended on the person's conscience as to how they handled it.
And as in reality, you're doing it. The person watching who doesn't realize it's right or left anyway, because half the time they're just going through their motions too, because that's what they're told to do. The group herd mentality.
And as you saw in the documentation, there are witnesses who had two different points of view at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they didn't look too favorable at each other as to how it was handled. But on the whole, the witnesses did refuse to Heil Hitler. They did try to choose a non-combatant stance or a conscientious objection stance, regardless if it might have cost them their lives. In Garbe's book, he talks about two Jehovah's Witnesses who went hiding in barns and haylofts because of, trying to avoid the military. Two Jehovah's Witnesses were hiding in barns and haylofts. One Jehovah's Witness hid in Berlin for a period of 4 months. So a lot of them went into hiding. And so it says, during the final months of the war, 7 Bible students were sent to Buchenwald because they refused to join a military unit. On October 22nd, 1944, a 55-year-old auto mechanic from Hamburg received his draft. Immediately, he sent a letter to the leader of the operation informing him, enclosed, I am returning the uncompleted forms. I am not able to join this unit. I am a practicing Christian and a free person. My religious beliefs do not allow me to participate in political or military activities. I also want to mention that because of being a Bible student, I've had 2 previous convictions. A few days later, this Jehovah's Witness was summoned to the Gestapo. There he was accused of conduct that revealed an unpatriotic attitude. In response, he stated, "I'm accused of not submitting to the authorities. However, I do not think that I have to be obedient to worldly authorities. I rather have to obey the authority of God, who requires us to keep his commandments."
Now, once again, refer to our discussion, okay, who the higher authorities are.
Yeah, and they immediately arrested him. That whole Romans 13 stance here is what is encouraging the witnesses to do what they had done. So check out our two
And
witness rule.
there it's blatantly obvious. He's making that statement. I don't have to be obedient to a worldly authority. So then who is your authority?
Yeah. But again, they stood firm in their convictions. They were very strong in what they believed. How many other Christians were not as strong? How many other Christians were just as strong? We'll look into some of other denomination stories more as our discussion progresses.